Okay, I am now recording. Mind your language. I'll try to mind mine. That's a joke, by the way. I don't mind bad language. Okay, hi everybody. Great to see you again. Welcome back. I want to plunge today directly into Villette, but not before raising what I think are some fundamental questions about what it is we're doing when we approach a novel. And these are open-ended questions, and I'm just going to leave them with you. Okay, I'm not interested in coming up with definitive answers to these, but I do think in a course that pretends to approach the question of selfness and the representation of the self in works of prose fiction, at least that's where we're starting this term, we should just have a handle on what we're talking about generically. Now, those of you who've taken other courses with me know that I often start our discussions about genres by asking what it is we understand these genres to be. So I do want to think a little bit today about what the novel is and what differentiates the novel from other forms of prose, and what possibilities are opened up by the novel in the exploration of the self, especially in the novel that is narrated in the first person. And of course, Villette is perhaps the most famous of the Victorian novels, the 19th century English novels, in its representation of a perversely contradictory female first-person narrator. Lucy Snow is as maddening as she is endearing, and I hope you all found yourselves rather frustrated by the many tricks she pulls to convince us that she is merely a background observer. So I want to think about Lucy as a narrator. That's what I want to do today. And I want to think about some of the literary conventions that this novel is working within. Before I do this, by the way, are there any questions or concerns about the course that I need to deal with before we move away from Taylor and into the literary text that I've asked you to read this year? Any problems with E-class, any of my own contradictions up there, or problems that you want to note? Because I'm still just getting back into this whole, what do they call it? Distance learning, whatever the hell that means. We're not supposed to call ourselves online because that would suggest that this is a professional online course, and it's not. It says, okay, we're all okay. Feel free to jump in at any point if you have any problems or concerns. So what is the novel? The novel is a work of prose fiction. So the question of the novel gives rise to these two other questions. What is prose and what is fiction? And once again, I'm not going to try to answer those questions today. We can discuss prose as not poetry. That's one way of thinking about prose. As works of writing that must take the form of sentences and paragraphs and so on. But just think about what prose is, and more pertinently, think about what fiction is. What a work of fiction claims to be doing. Is it simply lies? Is that what we mean by fiction? Is it delusion? So what is the novel? What is it generically? What is it formally? What structures can the novel take? Historically, what is the novel? When does it emerge in England? Most folks would argue early 18th century sees the emergence of the novel as we would now recognize it today, growing out of the romance and distancing itself from the romance by calling itself the history. I'm not going to go back to any of that, but these are questions that we need to think about when it comes to self-representation in the novel. That is, my own theory about the novel is that the novel, the realist novel, and Villette is within the realist tradition, works, at least on one level, to resolve social contradictions on the level of the imaginary that are irresolvable in actual real life. That what the work of prose fiction can do is present answers to questions that plague us in real life that are not available to us in real life. And that's what the imagination can do, that the novel resolves real social contradictions on the level of the imaginary. I'll return to this point over the course of the term. Don't worry about it too much right now. But what I want you just to think about is what the novel makes possible that other forms of writing, the history, the essay, other forms of nonfiction do not make possible, especially on the question of self-construction and self-invention. Anything that we know about Lucy Snow, a character in a work of prose fiction, she tells us. So we only have access to who Lucy is. And of course, she's a character. She's words on a page. That's all she is. I get that. But moving past that initial observation, everything that we get to know about her, she tells us. But we also infer certain things about Lucy by what she doesn't tell us, and also by the way in which she tells us things about herself. So we as readers come to certain conclusions about Lucy Snow as a character, about her personality, as it were, and I put that in big quotation marks, okay, through her own first-person narration. She tends to undermine herself and to contradict herself and to misrepresent herself throughout the novel. And we have clues, the novel gives us certain clues that she's doing that. But let's just think about those questions for a moment. Following on the question of what is the novel, another question, what is narrative? I'm going to actually put a definition of narrative up on eClass at some point a little bit later today, but what does it mean to narrate? To tell, to explain, to relate, to account for. What is narrative? A narrative text is one in which an agent of some sort relates a narrative, an account, but it's also, of course, an art or a technique. When we think about novels as narratives, we're thinking about a totalizing structure that organizes events in certain ways and makes connections between them. That's what a narrative is. It's not simply a listing of, a straightforward presentation of events and happenings. It's the organization of those events and happenings into a certain structure that creates a narrative. A narrative tells a story by drawing links between the events and the happenings in that story. So a narrative is all about connections. And our job as readers of narrative is to decipher the various narrative techniques that are used to make those connections. So a narrative is a story that binds together events in particular structures, okay? It's an organizing, often chronologically. Notice how this novel is structured. Youth to early middle age, okay? The novel gives us certain hints about the trajectory, the chronology that it wants to trace. So chronologically, in order of appearance, as it were, and temporally, a novel creates not only a setting, a geography, a place. It not only presents us with characters, it also presents us with a time frame. And that time frame is very important in the emergence of Lucy Snow as an individual. Once again, I put that in quotation marks because, of course, she's a character. She's not a person, although I will occasionally elide those two things. But we do need to be aware of the fact that Lucy Snow does not need to conform to any of our expectations of a person in real life. She's a literary character. Okay, I'm going off on a few tangents here, but these are just interests that inform the conversations I want to have with you this term. So a narrative is an arranging of disparate and seemingly unconnected events into a logical and meaningful form. The success of any given narrative has everything to do with the way it connects things together. But I'm going to point out a couple of things that Victorian novelists do that make us aware of the fact that this is a work of fiction as opposed to a work of history. Okay. What about, for example, the central role of circumstance and chance in the Victorian novel? For example, Lucy's reconnection in Villette with Graham and Mrs. Breton. What are the chances? There are millions of people living in Europe. Why are characters always bumping into other characters that they already know in cities all across the continent? It's pure happenstance. It's pure chance. But the narrative requires those reunions in order to tell its story. So happenstance and chance play a central role in a lot of Victorian fiction. How do casual and accidental encounters and reunions and so on function as essential plot elements in Victorian fictional narrative? Plot, of course, is a central component of narrative. Plot is the what happens in a narrative, but not only the what happens, but how does it happen? Plot is the structure that binds together events into a particular arrangement or order. Okay, third question. So what is a novel? What is narrative? And this is the central question. What is a narrator? Obviously, a narrator is a teller, a storyteller of some sort, an accounter, but constructed in a certain kind of language. And what kind of narrator is Lucy Snow? That's the main question I want to engage with today. We do need to always keep in mind the distinction between the narrator and the author. Although at certain moments in certain texts we read this year, the narrator and the author seem to be the same figure, okay? But in Villette, that's obviously not the case. A narrator is the author of her or himself, we might say, as opposed to the author of the text, okay? An agent asserting control over the narrative and hence in some way over the reader, okay? We take on their perspective and therefore get to know what they know. Her or his knowledge becomes our shared knowledge with them, okay? Another question we're going to ask this term is, can we talk about gendered narratives? Is Lucy Snow's way of narrating herself, of telling her own story, fundamentally different than Pip's is in Great Expectations because they are characters who assume different genders? Is there gendered writing, you might ask? And some of you have probably done some work on this question in the past, and you might want to share some of your insights with us. My fourth question is, what is an agent? An individual who has agency, a person who takes an active role on her own or in others' behalf with the power or the authority to act. Lucy is constantly questioning her own agency and whether or not she wants to act or continue in her self-professed role as a background observer. What makes a good narrator is one of the questions that Villette actually asks of itself. Okay, and my final question is, these are all, aren't these such obvious questions, but we too rarely actually think about these fundamental literary terms. What is a character? Many books have been written on the question of character and how characters are constructed in language. Okay, what is characterization? What does it mean? What does it mean to build a persona out of language? Because that's what a character fundamentally is. A character is words on a page, right? How are characters constructed? By whom? As perhaps types of what other kinds of characters, or as individuals, okay? Lucy Snow, in fact, develops her own theory of character in the early chapters of Villette, and I want to look at some of those passages. What does it mean to have character? Well, he's a real character. You're going to enjoy meeting him, or she's a real character. That's why she's one of my best friends. She's got lots of character. What kind of usage are we making of the word character in that question? To be a character, okay? Are we characters? Are we characters in our own narratives? What narratives do we construct for ourselves? Okay. I'm going to do something slightly unorthodox. I'm going to go straight into the novel. And I want to look at two passages. And I'm going to put these passages to you and ask you to tell me who Lucy Snow is from these two passages, both early in the novel. If you have your text in front of you, is this the one that most of you managed to get your hands on, the broad view? Okay. So I'll be giving you page numbers. I'll also give you chapter numbers if I have them to hand. The first passage I want to look at is on page 99, and it's the first two paragraphs of chapter 4, Miss Marchmont. I'm going to read those two paragraphs, and then I'm going to jump ahead in the narrative to volume 2, chapter 16, and page 244. I'll find that reference for you in just a moment. But let's start with page 99, first couple paragraphs of chapter 4. On quitting Breton, which I did a few weeks after Paulina's departure, little thinking that I was never again to visit it, never more to tread its calm old streets, I betook myself home, having been absent for 6 months. It will be conjectured, there's my first emphasis, by whom? It will be conjectured by whom? Here, the reader is being implicitly engaged with as the reader of a narrative, right? Asked to do some sleuth work, some detective work. It will be conjectured that I was, of course, glad to return to the bosom of my kindred. Well, the amiable conjecture does no harm, and may therefore be safely left uncontradicted. Far from saying nay, indeed, I will permit the reader to picture me for the next 8 years as a bark slumbering through halcyon weather in a harbor still as glass, the steersman stretched on the little deck, his face up to heaven, his eyes closed, buried, if you will, in a long prayer. A great many women and girls are supposed to pass their lives something in that fashion. Why not I with the rest? Picture me then, idle, basking, plump and happy, stretched on a cushioned deck, warmed with constant sunshine, rocked by breezes indolently soft. However, it cannot be concealed that, in that case, I must somehow have fallen overboard, or that there must have been a wreck at last. I too well remember a time, a long time, of cold, of danger, of contention. To this hour, when I have the nightmare, it repeats the rush and saltness of briny waves in my throat and their icy pressure on my lungs. I even know there was a storm, and that not of 1 hour or 1 day. For many days and nights, neither sun nor stars appeared. We cast with our own hands the tacking of the ship. A heavy tempest lay on us. All hope that we should be saved was taken away. In fine, the ship was lost, the crew perished. Okay, highly metaphorical language. And I find this a very strange passage. Dear reader, imagine what you will. I'm not going to tell you how I spent those 8 years. Sure, go ahead. Think of me laying, basking in the sun on a comfortable deck of a ship, floating through life easily. But there was a shipwreck. That's not what happened. Why this metaphorical language? Why the metaphor of the ship? For those of you who've managed to finish the novel, you know shipwrecks come in again late in the novel. But also, why this reticence? Why this refusal to tell us what her difficulties were over this long course of years, a significant temporal period in her life and in the narrative? Okay, so think of the language she uses there and the way she engages with the reader. And the second passage I want to look at, and then I'm going to ask you guys to do a little bit of work just focusing carefully on the language of these passages, is on page 244 of my edition, 2/3 of the way down that page. Once again, this is the first chapter of volume 2, chapter 16, about 3 pages from the end of that chapter. The paragraph beginning, "For reader, this tall young man." Now, this is the passage in which she encounters a figure from her youth, Graham Bretton, who is going by a different name and seems to have a different identity. So it's a moment of rediscovery of her past, okay? It's one of the many moments in the novel where Lucy encounters her own past in other characters from her past. And then life starts up again from there. So I'm just going to read this fairly long passage here. For a reader, once again, the narrator addresses the reader. We are implicated here, okay? We can call Lucy a kind of intrusive narrator in this sense. For a reader, this tall young man, this darting son, this host of mine, this Graham Bretton was Dr. John. Dr. John is no other than Graham Bretton, her childhood companion. He and no other. And what is more, I ascertained this identity scarcely with surprise. So the whole question of identity. What is more, when I heard Graham step on the stairs, I knew what manner of figure would enter and for whose aspect to prepare my eyes. The discovery was not of today. Its dawn had penetrated my perceptions long since. Of course, I remembered young Bretton well. And though 10 years, from 16 to 26, may greatly change the boy as they mature him to the man, yet they could bring no such utter difference as would suffice wholly to blind my eyes or baffle my memory. Dr. John Graham Bretton retained still an affinity to the youth of 16. He had his eyes, he had some of his features, to wit, all the excellently molded lower half of the face. I found him out soon. I first recognized him on that occasion, noted several chapters back. You might want to just highlight that peculiar phrase. Noted several chapters back, the narrator as the writer, as novelist, I suppose, as memoirist. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. I want you to think about that. Noted several chapters back, when my unguardedly fixed attention had drawn on me the mortification of an implied rebuke. Subsequent observation confirmed at every point that early surmise. I traced in the gesture, the port and the habits of his manhood, all his boy's promise. I heard in his now deep tones the accent of former days. Certain turns of phrase, peculiar to him of old, were peculiar to him still. And so was many a trick of eye and lip, many a smile, many a sudden ray leveled from the irid under his well-charactered brow. There's an interesting use of the word character. To say anything on the subject, to hint at my discovery, had not suited my habits of thought or assimilated with my system of feeling. On the contrary, I had preferred to keep the matter to myself. I liked entering his presence, covered with a cloud he had not seen through, while he stood before me under a ray of special illumination, which shone all partial over his head, trembled about his feet, and cast light no further. Well, I knew that to him it could make little difference were I to come forward and announce, "This is Lucy Snow." So I kept back in my teacher's place. And as he never asked my name, so I never gave it. He heard me called Miss and Miss Lucy. He never heard the surname Snow. As to spontaneous recognition, though I perhaps was still less changed than he, the idea never approached his mind, and why should I suggest it? Okay, there's no exam in this course, but if there was, and what if I did something nasty like this to you, and I put that last passage on the exam and said, carry out a close reading of this passage and tell me what it says about Lucy Snow as a character. How would you describe her? How do you read Lucy in this passage? Not only through what she says about herself, but what she actually does. Does this passage strike any of the rest of you as slightly perverse, slightly odd? What's going on here? What's Lucy saying about herself? What's she telling us about herself? And what do you make of it?
She's definitely she definitely views herself as a secondary character, and I've picked that up from the start, is that she doesn't really see herself as a protagonist, and that's fascinating that she doesn't even see herself as a protagonist in her own story. And she's just like, no, I'm just here, and I'm not much. But I think it's so weird that she doesn't reintroduce herself again. Like, I find it so strange that that's an old friend and she's just like, no, I'm not important enough for him to pay attention to me. I'm just like, Lucy, get some self-esteem, girl, come on.
Okay, so two interesting concepts there. One, weird. This is weird. And two, protagonist. Is Lucy the protagonist of her own narrative? What is a protagonist? What kind of character is a protagonist? I'm going to leave those questions on the table. Thanks for that, Abigail. But I do want to get back to this question of the weirdness of the passage. I see a few other hands up, so I'm just going to take them in the order that I see them on my screen. And do feel, does everyone know how to use the little hand function on Zoom? You're probably all much more proficient with this than I, but if you put up your little hand, I can see that you have something you want to say, and that's great. So, okay, Cheyenne.
Okay, well, I don't know how monumental my little addition is, but just what struck me the most is that, like I don't know if patient is the right word, but we can tell that she has motivations that we don't understand yet. Like, I feel like, not that her character is patient per se, but like, I know life was different back then, but I tried to put myself in those shoes. I think my internet is unstable. I'm sorry if I'm glitching.
A little bit of glitching, but I can hear you, and I think everyone else probably can then too. So yes, just speak.
Okay.
Speak loud,
okay.
And it's all good.
So I tried to put myself in those shoes, and like you were saying, Abigail, I couldn't imagine just seeing an old friend like that and not introducing myself. But to contradict what you said a little bit, I don't know how much it has to do with her self-esteem so much as it does like her, again, her motivations. I just feel like they're, like you said, odd. Yeah, that's all I really have to say.
So you find the passage odd too. And what we're trying to do here is explain that impression, why it's odd, why it's weird. So patience, she constantly exhibits or proclaims her infinite patience. There are many points in the novel where she says, but who am I to complain? I don't want to complain, she keeps saying, after a passage in which she's just complained. And so there's this odd sort of apparent contradictoriness as well. Emily.
Yeah, when I read this, I found her to be unreliable, like an unreliable narrator, because I was like, oh, I didn't know that you knew this and you didn't bring us along with it. And I found that as her way of her inability to act, kind of. She's like constantly put into situations where she could do something and she never really does or says anything. Like she's constantly, I think, undervaluing her worth and her like opportunity. Like even when she was, I don't know, in the play, like she was like, there's this hesitation in her like life to start to have friends. So that's kind of how I saw this passage again, like her inability to act.
Ability to act or a refusal to act? Is that a decision or is that something over which she has no control?
I feel like she does have more control than she believes, because there's other characters who are also women within the novel that are, I think, who do act. Like I'm gonna say her name wrong, but it's Genevieve or something like that. But I feel like she is a very eccentric character, and Lucy's just very shy. So I do think that's something to do with her self-esteem, her inability to act. Yeah.
Shy, and yet also deliberately provocative at other points. The concept of the unreliable narrator, and I see lots of hands up, that's great, I'll get to all of you, is one that I do want to, I want us to think a little bit about. I know that we're all trained to talk about narrators as if they are reliable or believable. But the question that arises from the concept of the unreliable narrator is whether or not they have that responsibility in the first place, and to what are they, according to what standards are they reliable or unreliable? That is, the idea of the unreliable narrator is that the narrator is not telling us the truth, but we are dealing with works of fiction here. And so in a sense, there is no truth to be told. Truth is constructed in fictional narratives. And so if she's unreliable, is that simply another way of thinking about the fact that there are certain things she chooses to conceal? So it's not perhaps, and maybe she is unreliable, but perhaps it's got more to do with the fact that she is selective about what information she will share with other characters in the novel, but also with us. In that first passage I read, I just feel free to imagine me doing this, but I'm telling you that's not what I did. But I'm not going to tell you what I did. And I'm not going to tell you what kind of emotional and psychological shipwreck I experienced and what my tragedy is. And then our question is, why aren't you telling us this? Why aren't you divulging? Why aren't you revealing yourself? She's a very peculiar kind of narrator. She is evasive, right? She's an evasive narrator. There are certain things she doesn't want us to know about her. And in the second passage, and some of you are probably going to say this, but it's almost as if she's spying on someone else. It's the same discomfort I have teaching this way. I have to have my camera on, but my students, and I totally understand this. A lot of my students don't have their camera. They can see me, I can't see them. That's a discombobulating experience. It's a very strange one. And I'm kind of getting used to it now. I just put the cone over my head and pretend I'm actually talking, face to face with people. But anyways, I won't get into that. Zoya, you were the next with your hand.
I think I haven't gotten to the end of this, so I'm just trying to steer clear of any spoilers, but I was quite annoyed by Lucy's narration just because she keeps pretending to be this sort of distant narrator, but at the same time passes judgment on the character's internal ideas. Just, takes up that even on the ship, I think I distinctly marked out some passages where she'd look at them, and specifically the class, she tried to categorize them and pretend as though she knows their profession and such. And I think, and the section that we read out, especially on where she tries to play in almost as though she's very aware of commanding the narrative, where she's leading the reader to believe something and is aware of that and then goes the other way. So I don't think she lacks confidence, or I think she's pretending to be this narrator, and at the same time is getting the reader in a sense, because now that everybody is kind of sympathizing with her in a sense, I'm kind of introspecting whether I'm projecting my own beliefs on her. But yeah, I think she's interesting, but I'm kind of annoyed by her so far.
You and thousands of other critics find Lucy Snow annoying, and that's the word you use, and judgmental. And of course, she's both of those things. I think, and that's quite intentional. She's classist. She's condescending. I think you said she leads us on quite intentionally. One of the questions that arises is, if she doesn't have control over her own destiny, if she's simply floating on the waves of other demands and other exigencies, she does exert control over her narrative. And in passages like the two we just read, that's where she's most authoritative about her exertion of control, by withholding knowledge, right? We want to know what happened to her. She's not going to tell us. What effect does that have on us? What effect does it have on the narrative? So there is a certain sense in which her coyness, her leading us on, that annoying propensity to titillate us. I knew this all along. I knew this chapters ago, she says. Go back, dear reader, and check it out and find evidence of this claim. I knew this chapters ago, but I chose not to let Graham knew that I knew who he was. I let him live in his own delusion. And I'm going to see what I can get out of this. That's what she's doing. But get out of it for what purposes? I would say for narrative purposes. So Lucy's control is over her own narrative, not over what actually happens to her, but about the way she relates it. And the question arises, and I'm going to come right to you now, Laura. I see your hand still up there. Is whether or not this can be read as a feminist or a proto-feminist assertion of control over the only thing that she can make that assertion over, which is her own words. What were you going to say, Laura? Sorry for going on there, but
I'm not sure. This might kind of just be repeating what you just said. I feel like I'm going to touch on some of the same points, but reading the novel, I felt like Lucy keeps her cards close to the chest. She likes having knowledge, and more than that, she likes being the only one who has that knowledge. And I feel like this plot twist, if that's what you want to call it, is one of the best pieces of evidence of that, because she not only is keeping that knowledge from the reader, she's also keeping it from the other characters in the story. She's not telling Graham, and she's not telling the reader. She knows that Dr. John is Graham Bratton, but she's not going to tell anyone that. And I feel like the moments where she is revealing her lack of telling reveal a sort of sense of superiority. She feels, I don't know, when I read these passages, I feel like there's a little like, look how much I know more than you. I didn't tell you this. How does it feel to be narratively at my whim? And I don't know, I thought that added an interesting layer to her character.
So there's something going on with control and telling or not telling. That disclosure and revelation are her choices. She gets to decide when and if she will tell us. So reticence or silence, or even we might say a certain kind of inactivity, is in fact a form of power that she has. So evasion and secrecy as modes of control that are available perhaps to a female narrator. When we come to Great Expectations, as you can see, Pip doesn't even have a thought without immediately saying it, right? That is, there's absolutely no attempt on his part as a male first-person narrator to keep secrets from the reader or from other characters. In fact, he's always blurting things out and then regretting it afterwards. So I think one thing I think we can conclude from these are from your comments, perhaps that what one of the things that these two passages tell us is that Lucy Snow is highly conscious of the fact that her manipulation of the way she tells her own story, her autobiography, as it were, because this is kind of an autobiographical novel of Lucy Snow, is her singular means of asserting some kind of control in an otherwise chaotic and uncontrollable world. To write is to take on a certain kind of power, right? To write oneself, so that she refuses to disclose to us certain things about herself. And the whole question of identity and how we know who characters are is highlighted in this second passage in particular. I wanted to, this one sentence in here, so you're helping me think through this in really interesting ways. That final sentence in that second passage that you read on page 245, as to spontaneous recognition, though I perhaps was still less changed than he, the idea never approached his mind. And why should I suggest it? What does she do? We might all have been guilty at some point in our lives of this kind of dissimulation that she's practicing on poor Graham here. But why can't Graham recognize her, but she can recognize him? What's being said about powers of observation here? Isn't Lucy, as narrator, the supreme observer? Isn't that what she said in the earlier passage? There are so many passages in the novel where she says, I was there in the room, but I was largely unnoticed. I was invisible. And so I sat and watched and I recorded what I saw. Sorry, Artemy, I see your hand up there and I saw it up before and then it disappeared. Artemy, what were you gonna say?
Well, a lot of my classmates and yourself have had some excellent points. I didn't want to step on anyone's toes, so great work. The only thing I just wanted to maybe add to the fact that like his name changes, like he goes from Graham to Dr. John Graham, and I think that like identifies something to do with like the class transition, so to speak, and like the power dynamic, and perhaps he has changed. Like I believe his father is a physician, and like so he kind of got to that point that in his class, but maybe Lucy doesn't feel equal with him, or maybe like worth to notice because of that. And yeah, that's kind of what I just wanted to bring up, just the class power dynamics there.
Absolutely. And in fact, and I was going to make this observation. Lucy's very inscrutability, that is that she refuses to let people know her, and her invisibility. She's not physically attractive. She repeats that point over and over and over again. So there's a certain kind of social obscurity to her that lends her the power of the observer. And that makes her an ideal narrator, because the best storytellers are those who look most closely, right? So we'll get back. I'm going to take these final two observations, and we'll get back to this point on Wednesday. I just wanted to ask this question: when does she first name herself? Anyone notice that? The postponement, the delay. She doesn't name herself at all in the first paragraph. Sorry, in the first chapter. Most memoirs and autobiographies begin with, in the very first sentence, a few pieces of pertinent information. My name is so-and-so. I was born in such and such a year in such and such a town. This is my story. She doesn't do that. She doesn't let us know what her name is until the second chapter. So let's leave that with you to think about that fact, names and naming. Okay, Abigail, and then Madison.
I just have like a very small observation. As a woman, I think she's very used to not being asked about herself. And you know, like she says that she's sitting in a room and nobody notices her. And I had no idea who she was in the first chapter at all. I was like, are we getting like a out of body narration? I don't know. What is this? And then it was a person. I was like, oh, cool. Okay, great. Sounds great. But I still don't know a whole hell of a lot about her. And I'm like 15 chapters in, and I still don't know much except that she figured out French and traveled there. But I think that because she's used to people not asking things about herself, she keeps things close to her chest, like Laura said. And that, I don't know, my thought was there and then it disappeared. So
we'll continue to investigate this, this question of who she is over the next couple of weeks. And we'll, when we come back to the text on Wednesday, we'll start at the beginning and see what it is she actually says about herself and what she doesn't say about herself. What were you going to say, Madison?
I was just going to comment about how her observation of Dr. John being her childhood friend is really interesting in the way that it like creates a power dynamic between her and the reader. It's almost like her, you know, saying, I know more than you, I've been observing more than you, and then it kind of challenges you to, you know, see if you can pick up these things before she reveals them. And I found that that was really interesting. You know, it was kind of like a puzzle. I was like, what's she gonna try and slip past me next? So yeah, I just thought that that was a really interesting tactic.
She's super self-conscious about the act of writing and that the power that that confers on her. When she says, go back a few chapters, as opposed to go back a few years. So she goes back in the literal text, right? That's a metatextual moment, a meta-narrative moment, where she refers directly to the act of writing this novel. And those moments in the text challenge us as readers to read the text as evidence. And if we've missed bits of evidence, she'll provide us with references to where we missed it. Go back a few chapters. I know you missed that, reader, but I put it there for you to read. So we are detective figures in a sense in this novel, and it's our job to peel back as much as we can of the layers of her narrative to discover who she really is. But that's the wrong question, because there is no she there. There's only a character. There's only written words. She is the words that she speaks, but we fill in all the blanks by her in those moments when she refuses to speak. And there's that, and this will be my final comment. There's that wonderful moment on page 94 of the text when she's sitting back and looking at other characters in the room. And she says, I was not long allowed the amusement of this study of character. She is the studier of other characters' character. But she refuses to divulge her own. And that's kind of sick puppy stuff. And that's what makes her so annoying and yet also so fascinating. Okay, we're out of time. This is great. We'll come back to the question of narrative, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Gothic on Wednesday as well, and a bit about Catholicism and Englishness and Protestantism, because we have to think about those things as well. In the meantime, thanks everyone. I'll see you on Wednesday. I put the recording up on eClass, and I'm going to turn the recording off right now. Bye.